Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. We have with us today Zander Keig, who might as well, I think he should be an honorary co-host because he's on enough. And Zander, welcome again. And one of our favorite guests, Debbie Hayton. So it's so nice to see you again, Debbie. And you are the one who is in the later time zone. Did you bring a drink to this table?
Well, I'm not actually. It's a little bit later, but it's just early afternoon here now.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we're all coffeeing it because it's early for us, right?
Yeah.
Was anyone brave enough to put anything in their coffee? I was not. I still have to run today. Anyways. All right. So here we are. We have been talking about doing this podcast with Debbie and Zander for months now. And with that said, David, take us away.
Great. So I've been really excited about doing this because I think in some ways it's unusual, and I could be wrong. I think we're going to get into some interesting and sensitive territory. And part of what we've tried to do on Hold My Drink is to model how to have sensitive but thoughtful conversations with people that tend to be highly politicized if not done right. And so we're going to try to do that today. But before we get into some of the more sensitive areas, I wanted to really start out with, you're both trans activists, you're both been involved in the public discussion around trans health and trans issues in UK and the US. Maybe there's some differences there that are worth exploring as well. And I'm really interested in sort of the different experiences that you've had, one, Zander being a trans man and Debbie being a trans woman, and how you think that that's both similar and different from each other. Maybe Zander, we'll start with you on that. And what is your impression on how it's similar and different to be a trans man and a trans woman in this day and age?
Sure. Thank you, David. I'd like to say that I don't consider myself an activist, actually. I consider myself an advocate. And I do distinguish between the two. I have been an activist in my past, and by that I mean, raising a ruckus and causing a disturbance and shouting at people. And, for me, advocacy is just a bit more tame, and perhaps that's because I'm 55 years old and just don't have the energy for that kind of, activism anymore. Nor do I have the interest in that kind of anger. I just have no interest in that anymore. So similarities and dissimilarities. I think that I'll start with some of the dissimilarities. I think they have to do primarily with the fact that, generally speaking, depending on what age you come to an understanding of yourself as trans, and at what age you might embark on a medical transition in particular, the earlier years are then going to be steeped in the socialization of your natal or biological sex. So, I was until age 39 seen by all around me as a woman, a very masculine one most of my life, very much a tomboy in my younger years, but still nonetheless a woman, female. And so people treated me and had expectations of me based on that. That part of my life. And so I would say that's probably something that's dissimilar. I doubt that Debbie had that kind of experience, or that most trans women have that experience, unless, of course, they transition even socially at a very young age, before we start to differentiate in such a broad way that people can pick us out as boys and girls, which is pre-pubertal, right? And some dissimilarities might be that because of that socialization, how we come into the community might differ. So, for example, people used to think that most trans men came through the lesbian community, prior to transitioning into being men or males or whatever people language it, and that I don't think that that's the truth anymore. I don't think that it's the bulk of us. I think that people who are trans men come from a variety of sexual orientations prior, and then have different sexual orientations sometimes, or at least the object of their attraction changes if their sexual orientation doesn't. What I mean by that is, prior to my transition, I was attracted to women. I'm still attracted to women. The label was lesbian then, now it's straight guy, right? But my attraction actually didn't change, but the label changes. And so, I think a lot of people think that trans women come either through the drag queen community or the cross-dresser community, but not as much through the gay male community. I don't know if that's still true. That's sort of my old thinking, that perhaps that is the case. So then that route into the trans community is going to be very differently oriented. That since I came through the lesbian community and spent like a good couple of decades there, I was very familiar with gay rights movement, right? On a civil rights, on a social level, people who come from fully like straight worlds and then come into the LGBT community, they don't understand our culture, our vernacular, our history. And so I think there's some dissimilarities then in how we orient ourselves and how we acclimate to and how we adjust to or integrate into this broader LGBTQ community.
Yeah,
It's really interesting, Zander. It's lovely to meet you as well for the first time today. I think our experiences are different in the way that the experiences of the sexes generally are different. And from growing up, you're right, we had those different experiences. I thought it was interesting the way you were looking at the way our sexuality works in all this as well. I'm female attracted and always have been, so my sexual orientation never changed. And so when you were talking about the routing through the gay community for men, that wasn't me at all. It's something which was completely separate to me. I was a straight man who had the need to transition in midlife. I was a little bit older than you, but not much. When I did transition, it took me a long time to actually work through who I was, why I was doing it, and where I was coming from. I think now I would probably be happy. I'd be happy to describe myself as heterosexual in the same way I was always heterosexual, in that I'm male, my partner's female, which is an opposite sex relationship. So that's interesting how we look at how our sexuality fits there, in that who we're attracted to, and that definitely is part of us. In terms of the general experiences of trans men and trans women, from my observations is we're all human beings, and we've all had a remarkable history, I guess, which gives us all something very much in common. Beyond that, the differences do come down to, I think, as you said, our upbringing, our early socialization, which socialized me as a boy and would socialize as trans men as the opposite sex. But also, it's interesting looking at just how we're actually made. And it always amuses me in the trans community when you get a mixture of trans men and trans women, that sometimes it is a mirror image to what goes on in the rest of society. And I caught a conversation with about 6 trans women and 2 trans men. And if you hadn't known, if you just looked at a transcript, you'd have said that the trans women were still acting more like men than women, and the trans men were characteristically women in that conversation. And I do think that although we transition, we do carry things forward. And I do wonder how much of it is that our sex actually is part of us. And some of this, I think, does come down to nature as well as nurture. It's all very fascinating, and I really appreciate the chance to talk about it, because by talking about it, we might learn something.
Luke Angel had said one of the reasons why he thought that the activist community that was turning up the volume, let us say kindly, on all these issues was because they were mostly trans men and had been socialized. I'm sorry, trans women who had been socialized as men and behaved like men would behave. I thought that was an interesting observation. Maybe we can talk about. Did you want to respond to Debbie at all, Zander, on that?
Well, I mean, I would say my experience within mixed company in the trans community has garnered a similar experience as far as noticing the ways in which, you know, part of socialization is how to communicate and how to interact with individuals in a nonverbal way as well. And so if you walk into a space with a lot of trans people, you'll notice typically that the trans women are a lot larger, right, taller than the trans men overall, because of the fact that, you know, pre-transition, right, testosterone makes you know, natal males much taller than natal females. And so, and then also depending on what age we are when we come into, you know, starting our transition or going into the trans community, right, all those years, especially if you think about in the workplace, right, the different ways in which we're socialized and oriented in our workplace is about how to command attention. You know, prior to transition, that wasn't something that a lot of people focused much time on training me to do, like how to command attention in a meeting in the workplace. I got a lot of training in lesbian community on how to, you know, raise issues and be heard, but that's very different from running a meeting or running a department or running a corporation, which by and large trans women are going to have a lot more experience with than trans men are. And so then that comes into the community and the way we interact with each other. I think that's brilliant. It would be very interesting to do exactly that. Record a conversation, multiple, and then read transcripts. Have other people who are not part of the community read the transcripts, and they probably would catalog people based on exactly what Debbie said. And I think that's just because there's a lot to undo, and not all of us are wanting or willing to undo all of our socialization. We're perfectly happy just bringing that part of ourselves into, you know, our quote new life, so to speak. You know, why make a big deal out of it? You know, people, a lot of times people think I'm a gay man because of the way I speak or the way I gesture or the way I'm interacting. I don't even know what it is I'm doing, but somehow I'm triggering in them something that says feminine or female. And so I'm not going to go out of my way to try and rid myself of those cues. It might be impossible to do, really. I don't know. But I have no interest in that. I'll just keep, you know, talking, and then I'll show up with my wife and people will be shocked.
Yeah, I think it's very much interesting what we bring in, what we bring of ourselves forwards and through transition. I didn't transition to lose myself, and I think that's really important to me. So there's things from my past which I brought forwards, and it's really important to me. And what Zander was saying about about conducting myself in meetings, I know how to get attention in meetings. I know how to hold people's attention in meetings and drive meetings forwards. The interesting experience I always have is if I'm in my work environment, I'm sometimes in meetings with people who just don't know my background, and much of my work is well away from transgender issues that people just don't know. Sometimes I think I'm clocked, and I think I'm clocked more often now than I was, because trans is more often in the news and people think about it. But if people aren't thinking about it, they don't pay any attention to it. And what's really interesting in meetings is if people clock me as trans, they will give way to me in the same way that they'll give way to men. Whereas if they don't, I have to work harder in order to get the attention and hold the thread of a debate in a meeting. And that, I think, just comes down to the way in which society is organised and the way in which we relate to each other. But what can be what has happened a few times is when I'm in a meeting and I haven't been clocked, and there's always that resistance, and a lot of it comes from women as opposed to men, in that me asserting myself in that meeting. If it becomes clear that I'm trans, at which point it just changes. And it's almost as if people think, oh, this explains things. This is why Debbie's being assertive, because Debbie's used to be a man, or really a man, or however people think about it. But the way in which humans interact is fascinating, and by crossing over in some respects is what we do. I think we learn more about it than other people, who sometimes, I think, there's just so much which you just take for granted and just passes by subliminally, that you just don't notice. And I think we do, because sometimes, especially when we think about it.
Yeah, we're learning more from gender roles in this conversation than I have in all the sociology courses and Twitter lectures, I think, combined. But from YouTube, thank you. So one of the things I became fascinated by, and it really came after a conversation we had with you, Debbie, was about how the experience of a trans man has psychologically, this experience of dysphoria that they have before they become a man, or before the person becomes a woman, and how that might differ among the two. And you raised a term that I had heard of, but I hadn't thought a lot of, and I know it's very controversial: autogynephilia. I think I pronounced that right. If I didn't, let me know. And I know that's something that you talked about with Jennifer and I after the podcast, and I know that many trans women do not experience that, or say that they don't experience that, and I don't know if there's a corollary for trans men. I have not heard about that, if there is. So I thought we would talk a little bit about that and how that might differ or be similar in the two experiences. Maybe we'll start with you on that one, Debbie.
First, Debbie, excuse me, I didn't mean to, but for our listeners, can you give a little background of what that is exactly? Because I said kind of a word that I think some people are unfamiliar.
Yeah, autogynephilia is controversial. It provokes a very strong reaction in people, and people do shut down the argument, do shut down the debate. They don't want it talked about. It's the theory behind it. It's one cause among several, I believe, what others have said as well, of transsexualism. That need to transition doesn't need to have just one single cause. There can be as many causes of this as there are of other symptoms in medicine and in society. So, what is autogynephilia? At its basis, it's a misdirected focus of sexual attraction. One of the differences between men and women, males and females, is sexual orientation. Most females are attracted to males. Most males are attracted to females. That's a difference, and it's probably in the high 90s%, depending on how you take the measure. But among heterosexual males, there are different, and I speak here as a heterosexual male, there are different focuses of sexual attraction. Some men are attracted to breasts, some to other areas of the female body, all sorts of things. Male sexuality is something which we don't much talk about either, for one reason or another. Now, men can be attracted to virtually anything. A friend of mine who worked in an emergency room in a hospital, when they found men coming in with various things stuck in various orifices, suggested that this was true. Yes, I was shaking the ketchup bottle and I slipped over. You know, those sort of conversations that people hear. But men can be attracted to anything. But in autogynephilia, it's our own bodies. So why not our own bodies? And that's the question, is why not? We can be attracted to virtually anything else. So it's our bodies. But there you end up with an impossible problem. The man is attracted to their own body, but they're also heterosexual. And that own body is male, but they've got a heterosexual attraction. And this is a circle that can't easily be squared. And you can see how there's various responses to this. Some men cross-dress to give an illusion of having a female body. Some men engage in, in fantasy or pornographic resources, and in that context there. But the ultimate really is changing your body in order to be a suitable target for that that sexual interest. That's basically what there is to it. And it provides such a strong disconnect and in the head, really, to say there must be a solution to this, and transforming your body so that it is it's what you would want to actually, it's what you're attracted to naturally, and solves the problem in some ways. It creates many other problems, but it solves some problem in some ways, because you're naturally attracted to something which you're attracted to. That's the whole basis of autogynephilia. Now, by what I've said there, apart from the ketchup bottles, I guess, which we can have a discussion about that. But in that way, it sounds pretty neutral. But it's surrounded by so much debate, so much negativity, and also as what I would say is, autogynephilia drove my transsexualism. I've talked about that. What I would say is, it means that I've got to take responsibility for what I've done. I changed my body to make my body more attractive to me, I guess. To make life easier for me, to make my body more desirable for me. But that was a very personal decision, which was taken for really quite selfish reasons. And that's something I need to take responsibility for. The standard model, which many other trans women will suggest, is they transitioned because they had a gender identity that was female. And that's different because suddenly you're saying, this was something which happened to me. I had this gender identity, not my fault, not my nothing I did or asked for, but I just had it. Therefore, I transitioned in response to that, and the same level of responsibility doesn't come with it, because you're just doing something, reacting to something which has happened to you. Whereas I come along and say, actually, I did this to make life easier for me, and I need to take some responsibility for this. And that, I think, that's an issue which we don't discuss. But yeah, autogynephilia, mention it in some company, and either the fireworks will go off, or debate will be shut down, or we'll just be, sometimes in other company, I'm accused of being a fetishist, and this is some fetish that you have, and it can lead to fetish, but it's much deeper than that.
Zander, what are your thoughts? And I want to know what your thoughts about what Debbie just said, and the very honest portrayal, but also whether there's a corollary in the trans man experience as well that you know of.
Well, I will just reinforce the statement that Debbie made, talking about autogynephilia, and the concept and subject of autogynephilia is very controversial. So there's no question about that. I actually know very little about it. And the reason for that is because, no, there really isn't a corollary in the trans male community, or FTM community, or trans male, or trans masculine. There's a lot of different terms that people use. I do believe I've heard a few people over the last 20 years, maybe, sort of talk about the possibility, but there's no real well thought out, category and concept in the same way, research, and definitely not, at least not that I know of. So if it is out there, somebody might be able to put it, into the chat box and share it with us. What I do find really interesting, and I agree with Debbie on as well, is that I think we all take very different routes to our medical transition. Those of us who are transsexual, we come to our understanding of ourselves, and we do what we do for very different reasons, and at very different times in our life, and in very different ways. And I am not that different from Debbie in the sense that I also transitioned to make life easier for me. And what I mean by that is, I did not grow up with a sense of being born in a wrong body. I did not grow up with a sense of I was supposed to be a man or I was supposed to be male. I did not grow up with those understandings. As a matter of fact, I really loved being a little tomboy and I loved being a lesbian. And I really actually was thankful for the fact that I had a body that worked because I was very sick as a child. And I contracted rubella from the MMR vaccination when I was 6 years old, and I was paralyzed. I was in a coma. So the fact that I'm upwardly mobile and able, and was able to make my way in the world, there was no way that I was at all having a problem with my body. Never. In that, maybe I thought, oh, I need to lose weight or something along the way, but not in the way that I hated my body or thought it was a quote wrong body. My body is the right body for me. Have I made some changes to it surgically? Yes, I have. But overall, it is my body and I'm thankful for it. It's not the wrong one. But what I mean by transitioning to make life easier for me is, and this is exactly what I did. I went to a presentation on testosterone, specifically dealing with, the prospect of transitioning from female to male back in, when was this now? 2005. And it was led by a physician who had worked with transgender patients for about 12 years at that point. And it was a room full of people. It was a big auditorium in a public library in San Francisco. And she just stood in front of the room with this huge like whiteboard in front of her and said, "What are your questions?" And wrote every single question down that we all had, and put little check marks next to the ones that were asked over and over and over again. And then she systematically went through and answered those questions. And the primary questions that people had was testosterone going to make me angry and aggressive? That was the primary question. And so at the end of that, I thought, oh, well, the only reason I had not started testosterone is because I believed that it would make me violent, because that's the socialization I got in society. As a woman, right, growing up, men were violent. Whether I experienced that violence firsthand or not, just men are violent, and it's the testosterone. And so I had this fear that testosterone would make me violent. When I learned from this physician that actually hormone imbalance of any kind can make one violent, it wasn't the actual testosterone that made people violent. I decided I'm going to start testosterone. And I went to go see her, and this is exactly what I said to her. I said, I'd like to take testosterone. I'd like to have male secondary characteristics because I think my masculinity would be more publicly and socially accepted if people thought I was a man, right? Because I was a very masculine woman, right? I was a dyke in lesbian community. I wasn't all the way like, uber butch or diesel dyke or any of those funny terms that people are aware of. I was more in that sort of androgynous place in the lesbian community, kind of in the middle. People remember that character on Saturday Night Live, Pat, People used to say, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And I'd be like, "What do you think, little kid?" Freak them out. And I even wrote a story in 2000 called "Are You a Boy or a Girl?" about that experience that I had over and over again in my adolescence, all the way up into my 30s. And so, I was very clear with her. Like, I don't believe I'm in the wrong body. I don't believe that I was supposed to be male. I don't believe I think like a man. I don't even know what that means. I just think if I were walking down the street and I looked and sounded like I do now, and I was right, by the way, people would leave me alone. Now, people leave me alone in the sense that I don't get called dyke as I'm walking down the road anymore. But what I didn't know at the time is that men are much more vulnerable and the target of violence and vitriol in society. I was under the impression that women experience the bulk of mistreatment in society. But I've come to learn that more men are assaulted than women when you look at, say, statistics of, who's beat up in public, who's held up by gunpoint, who's killed more often, right? It's men. And so I did open myself up to a little bit more of like the possible skirmish with the random man on the street, which I never had experienced prior to transition, that I've had to learn how to navigate over the last 15 or 16 years. But so And I agree also that we don't talk about this a lot in our community, that some of us transition just to make life easier, not because we're compelled to, not because if we don't, we're going to kill ourselves, not because we feel we're born in the wrong body, because we think we have some mental illness called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. By the way, gender dysphoria is going away. The Diagnostic Statistics Manual is going to be removing gender dysphoria and replacing it with gender incongruence. And they'll be putting it into a completely different category in that book. So the hope is that that will lessen the stigma. We'll see. I'm not sure if it will, but that is the goal, I think.
Can I ask a question about that? So you would say that gender dysphoria is when someone feels that they need to be in another body. And so you would say or they were born differently. Is that correct? And you would say you don't have gender dysphoria because you didn't change because you had any problem with your body, but to make life easier. Did I get that right?
I think gender dysphoria can be anything from really mild to severe. And I think the common understanding that you hear from people nowadays is you don't actually have to have gender dysphoria to transition, because just think of somebody like me, right? I don't believe that I had gender dysphoria. I believed, and I've written about this it's been years now, maybe 2007, I wrote about this, that I used to tell people, I don't have gender dysphoria. Society has gender dysphoria, right? Society expects me to perform a particular kind of femaleness or femininity that I'm just not going to do. It didn't come naturally to me to be a girly woman. I always, from the time I was a little kid, I've always been much more masculine. But I didn't have a sense of distress about it. I wasn't distressed about my masculinity. I wasn't distressed about my lesbianism. It was the people that I interacted with, they were distressed by it. So that's kind of how I make sense of it. A lot of people think gender dysphoria is only severe. It can be mild. It can also be in, quote, remission, so to speak, under the new, under gender dysphoria categorization, because once people transition, sometimes that gender dysphoria can go away. But again, it's very individual, and not everybody who has gender dysphoria has a desire to go through a medical transition or even a social transition. Some people are just gender non-conforming and can live their life with a sort of mild level of feeling out of sorts based on what society expects and what they do and don't like about their body, just like everybody else, right? Lots of people don't like parts about their body. They have maybe body dysmorphia. They have, attributes of their body that they don't like, that maybe their breasts are too small or too big, and so they have a surgery, something like that, right?
Well, it sounds like also, Debbie, to you, I mean, gender dysphoria is kind of a miscategorization for you as well, would you say?
Well, it's what gender dysphoria is. I remember one of the biggest challenges I faced before transition was trying to ask myself, did I have gender dysphoria or not? You talk about what this gender dysphoria is, and the definitions are circular. It's, well, you have a dysphoria with your gender, and to try and identify and pin down what this is difficult. It was called gender identity disorder. Now it's gender dysphoria, and in future with gender incongruence. But in some ways, this is an artificial diagnosis of the medical community. Really, there is a process of transition. Some of us have transitioned. Some of us have, whether we need to transition or we want to transition, we can have that debate. But there is this, let's just call it a need to transition. But the medical industry isn't happy with that. There has to be a diagnosis. So the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, before it gender identity disorder, was created really to allow access to the treatment, which came from what Harry Benjamin and others had put forward. You can't just have people signing up and saying, I think this will make my life better. What you have to have is a diagnosis which you are suffering from, which then requires medical treatment. It's how medicine works. So I wonder whether any of this diagnosis is necessary at all. If it keeps medics happy and insurance companies happy, and in our country the health service happy, then fair enough. But don't believe it's necessary. And the very fact that the terminology keeps changing and the understanding of it keeps changing suggests to me that it's more of a pragmatic diagnosis than a real diagnosis.
Yeah, the ICD, the International Code of Disorders, Disease and Disorders by the World Health Organization, I believe. They have they also have these manuals that have diagnoses in them, and then the American Psychiatric Association has the DSM, and the American Medical Association deals with these CPT codes for billing, right? So it's like, if you can't bill for something, then the service isn't provided, right? And so if you can't bill for it, the insurance company doesn't know how to pay for it. And so the only way to get something billed or coded originally is for a doctor to diagnose you, right? So it's all this it's very complex. It's almost like taxes, right? It's like very complex and very difficult to unravel. That there has to be a code, and somebody has to bill, and somebody has to be reimbursed, and there needs to be a diagnosis. And so, like a DSM diagnosis of gender dysphoria doesn't automatically trigger the insurance company paying for something. There are other CPT codes that go along with each procedure that we're getting done. It's very itemized down to the specifics.
One of my closest friends is a psychiatrist at a very, very large institution. He heads up hundreds of psychiatrists, and he was telling me that to him and many of his psychiatrist colleagues, a psychiatric diagnosis is simply a way of categorizing something for insurance companies. In other words, the actual human experience of being in mental distress is much, much more complicated than any diagnosis could possibly capture. But you need some kind of construct that allows you to talk about it, to categorize in some ways, but it's always going to be imperfect. And sometimes in categorizing in a certain way, we actually end up with not treating it in the way that we ought to. I wanted to see if we could go in a slightly different direction for a second. A couple weeks ago, I think I might have spoken to you about this privately, Zander. A couple weeks ago, I heard a fascinating conversation. It was on Andrew Sullivan's podcast with Andrew's gay. The two guests he had, Katie Herzog and Jamie Kirchick, are also gay. And they were talking about some of the trans issues, and each in their own way is sort of frustrated with sort of trans activism. And I think maybe the sense that they as gay people have been sort of sidelined in the movement. And but one thing that they were concerned about is puberty blockers, which just came out in a fascinating piece that Abigail Schreier did in Barry Weiss's Substack, and we could talk about that as well. But the argument was that if we give kids puberty blockers before they hit puberty, which is what puberty blockers do, they may not experience their sort of authentic sexuality, which they would if they were teens and went through puberty, and they may not realize that they were actually either gay or heterosexuals, and that they wouldn't settle, that their dysphoria might not pass. Or might otherwise pass if they had experienced that sexual surge that takes place during puberty. Do either of you have any thoughts on that? It didn't really come out in the Barry Weiss, Abigail Schreier piece, because they were really talking about why these puberty blockers might cause some problems that make actual transitioning later on in life more difficult. So it was a different take on it. But I wanted to go back to the Andrew Sullivan take.
I don't think we should be treating children in this way. I really don't. I've grave concerns about the treatment protocol, the Dutch protocol, as it's called, which is to try and identify proto-trans people before puberty, and then put them on a course, which means that they can develop in the same way as the opposite sex. I don't think we can make those predictions with any great amount of certainty. I've too many female friends in middle age who have been concerned that they would have been now in middle age, who would have been affected by this as children. Too many. So you can't get the target audience. Now I can't speak for natal females at all, but as a natal male growing up, some of my trans women friends point out that their life would have been so much better had they been identified at 9 years old and put on a course of action, which meant that they could have developed differently. And I counter that actually on a number of levels. Firstly, having reached 53 years old, I am who I am, and if things had been different, I would have been somebody different. And I'm happy with myself. I'm content and happy with myself. Secondly, I do look back at my transition now and think, was that the right thing to do? It helped me, but it had a negative effect on people around me. But I know that when I took those decisions, I was an adult. I had all the experience of being an adult. I knew what an adult meant. So I can look back and think, yes, I made that decision in full knowledge of who I was and full competency. And the other thing is, I'd already had my children by that point. I was already, transition gender surgery didn't sterilize me. I'd already had a vasectomy before then, so I was already sterile in that way. So I didn't lose that. And more the point, when I actually had gender surgery, the results were very good. But because I had, should we say, the parts could be recycled appropriately, and I had the parts to recycle. I worry about children. I worry about natal boys who are identifying as trans. We don't really ask why in too many cases. Sometimes it's that they've just like activities which are more typical of females. In the DSM, the diagnosis for childhood gender dysphoria actually talks about those activities. And so we don't, boys are there, we're not asking why. And then when the surgery comes about, there's a case of, Jazz Jennings, whose surgery was a lot less satisfactory than mine, which brings us full circle to the Abigail Schreier piece, because it was Marcy Bowers in that piece, the surgeon in that case, who is now casting doubt on whether it's the right thing to do. And when Marcy Bowers is casting doubt on this, then I don't feel so lonely and a bit of a lone wolf as I was doing.
Oh, this is such a big topic. I don't work with youth. And when I started my Master's of Social Work program, in orientation, the person sitting next to me said, "Are you going to work in child welfare?" And I was like, "Oh God, no." And they gave me this horrible look like I was a terrible person because I just knew I don't want to work with children. And it's not because I don't like children. It's because I don't like to see children suffer. And I think I would just be a constantly angry person because of how terrible how much children are suffering. So I went to work with adults. So I haven't worked with trans kids either in any capacity, whether it's professional or personal. I have been involved in a couple of organizations that have mostly parents in them, and they have their kids around, but I'm never really spending time with those kids, or I didn't. Maybe on a few occasions, the teenagers, but that's different. One of the things that, since I'm separated from this in some way because I don't work with children, I don't have children, I'm not involved in the schools in any way. So this isn't a topic that comes up for me on a regular basis. Outside of this, like talking about it on a podcast or reading, like say Abigail Schreier's piece. What it does is it just gives me more questions. So, like for example, I never really thought about the fertility issues from that perspective of, if you block puberty, then you're also blocking the process by which fertility happens, right? So if you stop a natal female's puberty from happening entirely, right, then there's no, what is the word be, like germination, right, of the eggs, in order to make them viable for if you want to take them out. I don't think you could take out the eggs of a person who's female if they haven't experienced that first whatever fertilization or whatever. I don't know what the language. Sorry, I'm not a biologist. And so it's like, I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I know that there's a huge criticism coming from the United States toward those countries that mandate sterilization for the legal process of changing perhaps your sex right in your country, right? Like I think Sweden used to mandate sterilization. Japan mandates sterilization before they'll change, the sex or gender that's on your documents, your government documents. And so here it's interesting then to think about it from the other perspective, which is if we block puberty, then we're creating sterilization. And why wouldn't we be equally alarmed about that? Right? It sounds to me like there's a similarity there that isn't being thought through. I know I haven't been thinking it through, and so I appreciated reading the article to get a little bit more perspective on that issue of fertility. There's this other issue of puberty blockers. When are they started, right? And is it necessary to use them? It just depends. Like I started puberty when I was 11. I don't know, at 11 you put somebody on cross-sex hormones. If at 11 years old I was in so much distress about my gender, which I wasn't, but had I been, puberty blockers I guess would have been used to sort of halt my continuation into my puberty. I wasn't too bothered by my puberty, so I can't really compare myself to it. I liked that when I went through puberty, I got bigger and stronger. I kind of liked, I was an athlete, so I kind of liked that I had a higher testosterone level. And I know that because my mother had it checked because she was worried about me. The doctor's like, your testosterone is higher than usual. You might be a lesbian. I think I was like 16. I'm like, I'm on like my second or third girlfriend, dude. Like, please. People are crazy. But that was, back in the 80s, early 80s. But it's like, so I haven't actually thought really long and hard and fully about these concepts. And I've protected myself because I don't work with kids, and it keeps me out of the controversy as well, because I don't have much to say because I'm not well informed. So I'll admit that. I'm not well informed, but I think there is a real reason to pause with concern around fertility issues. If mandating sterilization is not okay, I don't know why it would be okay to create sterilization with these blockers. I know why blockers are being used. Like I understand what's motivating people to want, right, especially parents, right, because their kids are in a lot of distress and they want to lower that distress level. Like I'm not at all bemoaning, what the motivation is. I'm just, now this issue around fertility really does give me a pause. But I want to make clear that I know that most of us have the capacity to reproduce, but I don't think that that's, my biological imperative was not to reproduce. So I don't want to come across as that sort of reproductive essentialist saying, we need to reproduce, our species. I think there's enough people doing that.
Right. So let me see if I'm capturing this in the way that you both think I should. The case against puberty blockers, it seems to me I've heard three things. One is sterilization. Two is that it may make it more surgically complicated and even dangerous later on in a transition if you don't have fully developed genitalia. And three, you haven't given the person a chance to go through puberty and see how their sexuality develops. Those are the three things I've heard. I've heard two things that might argue for it, which are, one is your child is in distress and you don't want them to be in distress, and two, you, especially I think for trans females, maybe more than trans males, it gives you a fighting chance to come off more typically as a woman if you've done the transition earlier before going through puberty. Did I capture that correctly? More or less?
I mean, I would say that that there's not the same surgical problems on the trans male side or the FTM side, because with puberty blockers, then they're not going to develop breasts, so they won't have to have chest reconstruction surgery. The likelihood of with cross-sex hormones is that maybe they'll end up with a more typical male arm length, which then would give them actually more skin, or torso length, which would give them more skin options for the skin types that are used to actually do the genital reconstruction, for the trans male. So we're not. And then also there'd be no menstruation, which a lot of people would be happy to forego. I know
Right.
I know I've been very happy about that. But I wanted to also mention that one thing I read in the article that I wasn't familiar with was the concerns that the proponent of the Dutch Protocol had way back in, like, what was it, like 2005 or
Yes.
6 or something, and that then it was brought over to the United States, at a children's hospital in Boston in like 2007. I had never heard that there were those concerns, and I've decided that I want to look into those, because they have the experience of running that protocol for a number of years, and after those numbers of years, if they had concerns around the same things that Dr. Bowers raises about, like, surgical outcomes, why were those things ignored, or why were they left out when bringing it over? Why didn't they figure out a way to mitigate that instead of repeat it? That would have been nice if they would have figured out, like, let's let them go through a short amount of puberty and then stop it, or just put them on cross-sex hormones, if they're at appropriate age and they've persisted right into this cross-sex identity. I didn't know about the Dutch protocol, providers being concerned.
Yeah, just picking up in the UK, yes, it was. It went to Boston in 2007. It was picked up in the UK around 2010 when the Paediatric Gender Services in England started a long-term study in 2010 to look at the experiences of children. They only just published that study last year, and they'd been asked for it and asked for it and asked for it. And finally, they published it last year. And one of their conclusions was there was no impact on psychological function, in that the children who had been put on this protocol, their psychological distress continued essentially. It wasn't in itself a solution to the problems that they were struggling with, but it is so mixed up with politics and so mixed up with this debate. It's very difficult to separate out the science. As a scientist myself, we should always be doing controlled experiments. In any other area of medicine, you'd be doing a controlled experiment. You'd be taking one cohort of children and another one, but nothing like that has ever been done. And I don't think it could be done, to say to a child, I'm sorry, you can't have the puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones because you're in the control group. It just wouldn't happen. And it's not something you can do as a double-blind test anyway. If you have testosterone injections or you don't, you're going to know the difference. So it's really difficult. But as a scientist, I am concerned about it. It doesn't seem to be improving the psychological function of children. And that's what it's supposed to be doing. And without proper controlled research into it, it is by its very nature an uncontrolled experiment.
So you guys, David, we have this kind of running thing where David asks the more philosophical, esoteric questions, and I tend towards the banal. So as we end up, I've got some more human interest questions. This one's directed mostly at you, Debbie, because I'm very interested. So you still you identify as a heterosexual, and you are married. I would just love to. What did your wife? You're still married, am I right? How did she react? You say that it was somewhat selfish, and I'm assuming that might have been towards some of your family. Can you give how did that dynamic work within your family? How's it going?
It was really difficult for my family at the time, and I didn't really appreciate what was happening. I remember making big announcements to say, I've worked out I'm really a woman, which means I've got to transition, and that's it really. So that's where I was. Stephanie had, and she has said that she felt she had no say in what was going on, and just had to go along with it, really. How we did manage to stay together, which is testament to her, really. If they are, in marriage, you talk about for better, for worse, and I think this was very worse. We have things have improved. We're talking 10 years ago now, and we've moved forward, but it's not what she would have wanted. It's not, it's still harder for her. She's recently had a new job, and so she's talking to people, and then again, she's got to decide when she's talking to people. It's fine for me to talk about my partner or my spouse, which she does, or try to avoid using the words husband, wife, and but eventually she has to come out every single time that yes, she has a transsexual partner, and that's not really what she wants to do. This is supposed to be the small talk. I'm married to so and so. We've got 2 children, 2 cats, and whatever. Whereas in her position, she says, "Yes, I'm married to Debbie, but Debbie transitioned." Suddenly, it's hard work, and it just keeps happening and never stops for her. So it's not it's not easy. It is selfish. I look now and say, well, I look back actually, and I think, well, had I known in 2011 what I know now, would I have transitioned? And I probably, I don't know. I say it's easy for me to say no, I wouldn't. But then you go back to the situation I was in 2011. I read through my journals at the time, and I was generally in a psychological mess. But yeah, it is hard, Jennifer, and yeah, but it's something that you would really need to speak to Stephanie about. That's that would be an interesting conversation for you. But if you do, I'd want to be well out of there, because it's it will be her platform and for her right to say, not for me to be there as well.
Interesting. Maybe we should do spouses next. And Zander, to you, I mean, I'd love to the extent that you're again comfortable with that. I mean, how does your spouse, does she identify as heterosexual, or how did you guys meet, and is there any story there that you can tell without divulging too much?
Well, Margaret's used to me talking about this by now. As a matter of fact, we just celebrated our 19th anniversary last month. And I started my medical transition 3 years into our relationship. So the first 3 years of our relationship, people would have called us a lesbian couple, but I was no longer identifying as a lesbian, and Margaret was never lesbian. Margaret was bisexual. But at the time I had told her, I'm trans identified, but I'm not going to do hormones. And for the reason I already mentioned, because I thought they'd make me angry and violent. And so it wasn't until I went to that, to that presentation by that physician about testosterone, I just came home from that and I said, I'm going to start testosterone. And she was like, what? And I'm like, it's not going to make me violent. It'll be okay. And she was like, all right. So I think she was she was caught off guard, of course. Yeah, quite frankly, I think a similar situation, as Debbie said. I didn't give her much choice in the matter. I was going to do what I was going to do. And transition is a very selfish act. It really is. And that doesn't always have to mean a negative. I think when you go through a second puberty, adolescence is very selfish. And so I think we go through a second puberty, and so we're selfish again, but we're doing it like me at age 39, which is just age inappropriate, and especially in a marriage. But thankfully, Margaret was quite amendable, and because she had that bisexual orientation, it wasn't going to be too far out of her comfort, level. But I do recall it was about a year after I started testosterone. I had my first surgery, which is the chest reconstruction, where it's like a double mastectomy, and then they do some reconstruction. So now I have what's considered a male contoured chest, for whatever that means. It just means they put the nipples and areolas in a different place on your chest, right? And remove most of that fatty tissue. Not all of it, but most of it, because otherwise you'd be kind of concave and it wouldn't look good. When I first told Margaret I was going to have that surgery, she was not very happy. That was a brief unhappiness, but she had related to my body in a very particular way, right? We were as a couple in our intimacy, and so I was going to be surgically removing a part of my body that she related to in an intimate manner. And I was by that point, I was much more open to hearing her concerns and her thoughts. I still went forward, obviously, with the surgery, but I wasn't so just sort of bulldozing it through like I had with testosterone. I was willing and and open to hearing. I was still going to have the surgery, but I wanted to hear her concerns about it, and we've been that way ever since, because I've had more surgeries, and so like what would be considered like genital reconstruction surgery, phalloplasty surgery, and so she's been there all through that, and so has been a trooper. And what I find the most surprising often is when I say to people, "Oh yeah, Margaret and I were celebrating our 19th anniversary," or back when it was 15 years, 10 years, whatever. Almost always the response from within trans community or among quote unquote our allies is, "Wow," right? People are shocked because they expect that the relationships are going to end, that people are going to go, "Oh no, pause, deal breaker, I'm out." And a lot of us are quite fortunate that our loved ones, they stick in with us through the thick and thin. They really are invested in the relationship, and they deal with those struggles, like Debbie mentioned about her wife in the workplace. Margaret has some similar things that come up because when we were quote a lesbian couple, she didn't get the same kinds of questions that she was all of a sudden going to get when she said, "I have a husband," right? And as a lesbian couple, so to speak, people didn't say, "Oh, do you have kids? Are you married? Do you own a house?" All those like quote unquote normal heterosexual things. But now she gets asked questions like that. And I don't know to what degree she's become more comfortable with it. I just think she doesn't like that we ask different questions based on sexual orientation and the couple configurations. That why don't people care that gay and lesbian couples are having kids or not having kids, right? So and maybe they are more so now because same-sex marriage is legal now. It wasn't back in the day when we got married, but I was legally male in California, so we were able to get married. But I think it would be great to have partners and spouses on. Margaret has definitely, joined me on occasion, but I think their ability to talk without us present is also really important.
Well, let's plan that part 2 if Stephanie would be interested in that as well, Debbie. I don't know.
I can ask.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Very privileged, but before and I feel very privileged to have this conversation. I feel like you guys both were very thoughtful and opened a conversation that many of us don't see, but that's also really healthy for us to have that, to be able to think about these issues with more nuance and to have a sort of an inside view of your lives, but also the conversation that should be had in public. So thank you.
Yeah,
can I say one thing about that, David? And that is that, back in the mid-'80s, when I was involved in public conversations around interpersonal violence, or what they used to call domestic violence within gay and lesbian couples, in particular lesbian couples, I was constantly told to not talk about that, to not, quote, air the dirty laundry, that we were better than those breeder couples, right? We were better than the heterosexuals, and we shouldn't talk about violence in the lesbian community within our couples. And so there are some similar taboo topics, within trans community that I think we should be able to talk about anything and all things right? Regardless of how sensitive, how controversial, or maybe how even ultimately proven wrong they might be. We should be able to have, I'm a free speech absolutist. We should be able to have these conversations and let the chips fall where they might, because if the non-trans world wants to use these kinds of things against us as trans people, I think we have enough integrity and we have enough history and we have enough support on our side to say, hey, some of us are really thriving, or some of us are contributing in really big ways to society, and some of us are raising wonderful children, and some of us are doing jobs in the world that are going to take us into the future scientifically and educationally and philosophically. We know we're not bad people. So I don't think that they're ever going to get that much ammunition to, quote, take us out as a people.
There's this great story about the monster at the end of this book. And it's about Grover, and you go through the book and you're wondering what horrible monster you might see at the end. And it's Grover's telling at this, and it's Grover himself at the end is the monster at the end of the book. And I feel like in many cases where we are scared to air these issues publicly because of the monster at the end of the book, and really the monster is just our own fears. And I think I'm glad to be able to model that, and at the end of the day show people you're safe and we're safe. Because we've had, and better off because we've had these thoughtful conversations than we would have been otherwise.
Well, and I don't know about you, Debbie, but I have faced consequences. I mean, I was recently removed as the chair of a committee for a national trans organization because of my heterodox, thinking. I'm speaking about things that people don't want me to speak about. And so I was removed from that position. I was asked to resign and I refused because that to me is dishonest. They want me gone. They have to remove me. And so that's what ultimately is happening. And so there are consequences for speaking on issues that are considered taboo. Have you faced similar consequences on your end?
Yes, I have. I've sat on committees in the UK, and I no longer sit on committees because my views were seen as unwelcome. First of all, people tried to remove me through disciplinary processes, but eventually the democratic process dealt with me in that, my views are not necessarily mainstream within our community, but I hold them sincerely, I hold them passionately, and I'm quite happy to debate those alongside other people's views, and then hopefully we can understand each other and take the best of what everybody thinks. But I've never been one to keep my mouth shut and do as I'm told, unfortunately.
Me either. I call that my inner dyke. I was trained to never shut up or be, So, sorry.
Very people. Well. You've been trained very well.
Such a pleasure to speak with you guys. Thank you so much. I hope to do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation. And it also, again, Debbie, it was wonderful to meet you. And I hope our paths cross again.
Likewise, Zander. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.